Hey guys, Sean Pruitt here. Today we're going to be discussing the basics of an oil and gas project overview. And what we're doing here is we're going to be developing 40 oil wells. We're going to be drilling 40 oil wells. And I recommend before looking at any oil deal, you need an experienced geologist. And I happen to have Kevin Fowler, who was the senior geologist at both Hunt Oil Company and Marathon Oil Corporation. Say hello, Kevin Fowler.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for your interest in our project.
And we're going to have a general discussion. And when I say general, it's going to be a brief overview, but this is an actual real program that we're currently funding right now. And so I'm going to have Kevin go over the basics of this program and give you an understanding of how a geologist goes about doing some diligence and choosing a lease location. So Kevin, tell me why did we choose this location to develop these 40 wells?
Well, while every area in Southwest New York, Northwest Pennsylvania is going to have oil and gas potential, I want to stay in an area where we are actually between or next to production, known economic production, not just where they have found oil, but where the oil is actually paid for the wells that were drilled there. What we're looking at is the 201-acre lease that we call the Wing Hollow lease, so named for a hollow right here that is shaped like an angel's wing. And we chose this spot because it is between two fields that are currently producing and that there is ongoing drilling in and around. The first field being this Kodiak field. This well that we're basing our production projections on is 1,300 feet from the corner of our lease. This field down here was drilled anywhere from 25 to 30 years ago. 26 out of 29 of the wells in this field are still producing. And this is an example of what we call our southern control. That would be this well right here, which is less than 300 feet from our property line. This well is 1,300 feet from our property line. Both wells produced. And since we have multiple sands here to work with, we decided that we would not do what the well to the north of us did and just complete in one zone, but we're going to complete in 6 different formations between about 600 feet and 1,900 feet in depth. These wells down here produced from 2 or 3 zones at a time. And while the production was not tracked for these wells because the state did not require specific production records prior to 1990, we were told, and judging by the wells still producing, we do believe that each well in this field has made over 4,000 barrels apiece. And when you look at the gas being about 2.5 MCF per barrel, we're probably looking at another 10,000 MCF of gas produced for each well in the field. So this has been a very healthy, very prolific field to the southeast. Of course, all of these wells came in. You don't see any dry hole symbols here. The wells to the north, this is a newer development since about 2013, but another well was drilled in September of this year, and another well was drilled, which is not shown on this state map, but it was drilled in October of this year within this field. Now, what we want to accomplish is...
Let me interject here, Kevin. Let me ask you a question. So the well right here in yellow, that well was drilled in 2013 and it produced for in 2 years. Didn't that return roughly 140% worth of energy?
Well, it returned what would have been, let's put it this way. One of our wells costs $180,000 to drill, frack, complete, and equip. Now, that is going to be a 6-formation completion. We're going to take all the oil and gas out of zones that 6 different zones between about 600 feet and 1,900 feet. This well, upon which we based our economic projections, completed in only one of those formations, not all 6 of them. Nevertheless, from that one zone, it made enough oil in 2 years' time to return 140% of the expense of our 6-zone wells.
So if that one zone could produce that much energy, what's the benefit of us tapping into 6 zones?
Well, we're going to encounter a number of zones on the way down to the same zone that this well completed in. And there is oil and gas in each of the 5 zones that are shallower than the Bradford Third, which is the bottom zone here. All the wells in the area pass through these 5 zones on the way down to the lowest zone. But traditionally, they only complete in that lowest zone because it's the thickest and they can do
Gotcha.
so with a single
So what
frac.
you're saying is if they could do that with 1 zone, imagine what we can do with 6.
Yes, in essence, yeah.
Good deal. Go ahead, Kevin. I'll let you keep going.
Okay. Now, what I wanted to do with this lease is bracket it between 2 producing wells. This one right here that came in at, I think it was 17 barrels a day, and this one came in at 21 barrels a day. We wanted to be between or within a project that had already shown potential practically within our lease already. This well is it's a stone's throw from our lease, and it has been one of these 29 wells that has been productive of 4,000 barrels and 10,000 MCF by itself alone. Now, the well to the north up here made about 1,900 barrels in its first year. And if you look at the economics pages, which are the last pages in the booklet, you'll see that we based our hypothetical well, and we're going to start in this portion of the lease. We based it on this Copper Ridge Oil Kodiak number K1 well, which made 1,900 barrels from 1 zone in its first year. So as not to blue sky the project or make promises that have no basis in reality, I said, okay, let's put 1,900 barrels of oil for the first year on our own well, and let's weigh it against the economics of our own well and see what happens. And what happens is you reach payout in about 18 months at $100 a barrel, about 22 months at $85 a barrel, and within 2 years' time, this well will have made 140% of the drilling and completion cost of the well that we are going to drill to 6 zones. And we feel pretty confident that the sand, producing sand we see in this well and the producing sands we see in this well, and you have the logs in the book to look at, will be the same things that we encounter, the same formations we encounter between 600 and 1,900 feet. And we're going to produce from every oil and gas bearing zone within the well, not just the lowest one. We're going to take the time and the effort to frack every oil and gas bearing zone that we encounter in every one of the wells that we drill in this lease.
Yeah, so that's phenomenal. So you base the hypothetical based upon 1 well with 1 zone versus having 6 zones. So the hypothetical is very conservative if you compare it to what we can accomplish with 6 zones. And here's the deal: this doesn't include the tax benefits. I mean, in addition to the income from the oil well, the investment inevitably is 100% tax deductible against your earned income. Discuss this with the CPA, but that's been the case thus far. So go ahead, Kevin.
Now, the economics I run in my book and the production that we show in the book versus the cost, I do not include any tax benefits or numbers at all. These are strictly dollars in, dollars out for the project. And we project these as if we had drilled the well to the north or the well to the south. We project the numbers to simulate what we think these 2 wells might have done during their first year, and what this one obviously did because we had the state production record. But the fact that we can finance one of our wells with 6 zones completion and a very well-assembled field production complex with gas separators, gas and oil pipelines, oil tanks set out next to the highway for easy pickup by the tankers and all. It's going to be a very clean and precisely done lease. But we can do that pretty confident that the economics of these older wells are more than sufficient to support the economics of our current wells, which will be more prolific in their production over time than these wells were. But we're not counting on our blue sky projections for 6 formations. Once again, we're stating that this well or this well would have paid out one of our new wells at our cost in a year and a half's time and returned 140% of the cost of our well with just the production that they made in the first 2 years.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah, we're being as conservative as we can. We're not pulling numbers out of the air. We are using actual state certified production numbers with the assumption that we'll at least equal what those wells of the past did.
Yeah, and one of the other huge benefits is the fact that this is an older field, and so not only are we surrounded by success, you also have infrastructure already in place. We don't have to wait years to get pipeline, gas lines, or any other thing out there. Electricity, everything's already in place. Infrastructure is already in place. And here's the thing: there are other operators developing out there in this area. And one thing I've noticed is that everyone else is charging much more. For instance, there's an outfit that is drilling a well for $200,000 and only giving half the revenue. Okay. And so we're drilling for less and we're giving a bigger percentage in the deal. And when I look at a lot of oil deals, and one of the things that I look at first is the financials. I know how much it costs to drill a well in New York and Texas and Oklahoma. And if their prices are double or 30 or 40% more, they're just putting that money in their pocket. And they could tell you, oh, because of higher oil prices, costs have gone up. And at the end of the day, they just want to make a lot of money, that's fine if they want to sell it for retail, but we don't buy retail. And Kevin is looked at multi-billion-dollar deals, and he knows how much it costs to develop, and he works with veteran oil and gas guys. And so this is a deal for a veteran oil and gas guy and also beginners. So it's got the best of every world. So where do you want to go from here, Kevin?
I'd really like to state why this is not the same as drilling a well in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Louisiana, because it's a very different type of project. So I started my career in the Gulf Coast. I'm a Houston native, and I started in the Houston oil business after I received my geology degrees. And we worked off of anticlines and fault traps and seismically proven structures and the sorts of wildcat wells that you would, that you'll see on TV or that you read about in the newspapers, where somebody rolls the dice and, my gosh, they made a big discovery. Well, I can tell you from my own experience and from having been in this business for 35 years that usually when you roll the dice in a wildcat, you miss, more than half the time. And when I drilled wells as an independent geologist in Colorado in the 80s, we hit about 40% of the ones we tried, which was okay for channel sand wildcat wells. But one thing I really did not enjoy doing was calling investors at 7:00 in the morning after logging a well overnight, because that's when you always seem to be logging a well, and telling them that unfortunately we had drilled a dry hole. That's a very painful phone call to make. But since I started working on these wells in Pennsylvania and New York in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I never had to make another call like that. The reason is our producing formations are stacked like layers in a cake. This is an area where you're not going to have spindle top 1,000 barrel of oil per day type of wells, but you will, I'll say this on the record, you will always find oil and gas in these wells. The difference is some produce a little more than others, and our big factor is oil price. We can make money drilling these wells down to about $40 a barrel. And we did so in the last decade of the 1990s to 2000, and then all the way up to where I started working for Marathon Oil in 2007. You will generally find a suite, S-U-I-T-E, a suite of pay sands from just below where the water sands end, that the farmers use for irrigation and people use for drinking, from about 600 feet down to as deep as 4,000 feet. You'll find alternating shales and sandstone, shale and sandstone. And invariably, the sandstones deeper than about 600 feet are oil and gas bearing only. They have a very small water fraction in them. So if you look at the density of wells that somebody drilled down here over a 40-year period, and that when people buy a property, see how closely they drill. These wells are about 400 feet apart in all directions, and they don't miss. Every one of these is an oil and gas well. The difference in what they do in their performance is based on how effectively they were fracked and how judiciously they were produced. That if they watched after the wells, did not pump them too hard to where they brought waxy paraffin into the well that would clog it up, that sort of thing. But when managed correctly, these wells will invariably pay out, and they will invariably go for decades. I'm still receiving royalties from wells that we drilled in 1993, 1994, 2004.
Which is phenomenal. That's what really excited me about doing business with Stephen Ford and Kevin Fowler, is that they showed me revenue checks from wells dating back all the way to the 80s. Okay. And so normally when I look at a lease, especially a lease that's been wells as old as the 80s, most of them are going to be capped. As where if you look to the southeast here, 80% of all these wells that were drilled in the 80s are still in production to this day. That's unheard of. And between Kevin Fowler and Stephen Ford, they've drilled 1,900 wells with less than 1% are dry holes. And I've never heard of that. It's absolutely remarkable.
Well, it's a product of the oil and gas province that we're operating in here. And we drilled the first of the West Union wells about 15 miles east of this project. And we based our first well on a deep well that was drilled about 1.5 miles southwest of us. When we drilled as deep as that well did, that is to say about 1,950 feet, we subsequently saw in our logs that we had encountered 175 feet of net oil and gas pay. And we have sent out the log analysis for the first couple of logs out there. We've only run 2 logs so far. The logs look essentially identical, but any geologist, in fact, the 2 geologists I've shown those logs to, have one of them has at this point indicated that he wants to get into the project, but the project's closed. But he is looking at this very project right now, the Wing Hollow project. The other geologist said, "Congratulations, this looks like an offshore well in how much pay sand it has." 175 feet of pay is just phenomenal for an onshore well in the United States. Wow. We're generally finding 40 or 50 feet of pay in a good well anywhere in the country, and you're very happy with that.
And that's amazing. And what Kevin is talking about previously before this program, we put together a program and funded it. And he's referencing the first few wells that have been drilled, the logs. Kevin and Stephen had expectations of this field. And just as they predicted, the logs came in beautiful. In fact, they came in better than we expected. And to hear a geologist wants to get involved after looking at logs, this says everything.
Take a look at the booklet, because I talk a lot about these 2 wells in the booklet. I show the logs, I show the pay zones within the logs, and I even show the completion reports for these wells that were filed with the state. And what they do is they indicate that this well to the north completed in only one zone, only the deepest zone. And yet it has been a nice well. I would encourage those who are interested in moving forward to look at each of these 2 logs. I want people to gain a reassurance that we picked up this property specifically because we're between 2 producing fields. And as you see down here, over an area that is about 4 miles wide, there is essentially no change from this well up, these wells up in here to this well back in here, these wells down in here. It's very consistent pay sands. And anywhere you would drill in this area, you would encounter the sands, you would encounter oil and gas. But I wanted to snuggle up between two wells that had made their payout. They had made their 100% ROI and to great excess of that. And
Can you explain now? This is something that I've asked a long time ago, but I don't recall. But typically in oil and gas, you want to find anticlines. And
yes, you do.
Yeah, and oil and gas migrates to its highest point within its own structure. It's not like a big old flat. It's normally like a rainbow, and you want to hit the apex of the rainbow in order to get the most oil and gas. If you hit the foot of it, you're not going to produce as much oil. And then if you miss it, you're hitting a dry hole. So I noticed that this is completely different. It seems like everywhere they develop, it hits. How does that work?
Well, if you were to take a giant razor and scrape off these 400 feet of terrain out in here, the hills and the valleys and all, and have a flat surface, you would find that if you drilled down from that flat surface, that you would find oil and gas sands that were oil and gas bearing and essentially flat from here all the way down to here. It would just be pretty much as flat as a pool table. And the reason that they are all oil and gas bearing is because the sand is low permeability, and there is no terrain here below the ground where oil and gas will migrate one way or the other. It's essentially flat. And when these sands were charged with hydrocarbons, and the sands out here were laid down about 440 million years ago, but when they were charged with hydrocarbons over the last maybe 100 million years, the hydrocarbons stayed in place because this is a seismically stable area. The sands are low permeability but high porosity. That means they have a lot of room within the sand to hold oil and gas in the pore spaces. But the sand is cemented within itself such that once the oil and gas was in place and the sands were super compressed over millions of years, the oil and gas was locked in place and did not migrate out from that. So you have both the flat sands and the low permeability nature of the reservoir itself, which holds the oil and gas in place, even if there had been a little terrain under the surface. So we have essentially layer cake, or what we call blanket formations here. And this is more of a resource harvest than it is, throwing the dice on whether there's going to be a structure. So we're taking advantage of the fact that if you can be close enough to areas that you absolutely know were economic, and we don't care whether wells down here some were better than others or whatever, that the field is drilled up. But we wanted to go to an area that was undrilled with a virgin reservoir, but between two prolific areas that had already shown that they had economically producible oil and gas in place. And I think we've accomplished that here.
Let me ask you this. So why isn't everybody not completing the same way you guys are? Wouldn't it make sense? It would make sense to me to not just produce from one zone, but to produce all the zones at the same time, like you guys are capable of doing. Why aren't the others doing it?
Well, I think that a lot of them are starting to do that now, but you always have to balance when you're a small operator, as most of these companies they're not majors or anything. They're companies that operate only in the Appalachian Basin, but they want to balance the cost of the well versus the returns on investment. And quite obviously and quite truly, that lowest zone is the thickest and best zone that you could drill out here. That's what they headed for. Sometimes, like in the field just to our southeast, you did have companies that went for 2 or even 3 additional zones, similar to what we're doing. But interestingly, a bunch of these wells actually kind of picked and chose from zones up and down the hole. I think they were probably afraid of depleting the formations of the wells next to them, although we found that 400 feet apart prevents that from being a danger. But they were balancing the cost of drilling and completing a well versus the returns on investment, and they went to the best zone, which is the lowest zone. But there is more pay sand if you add up the other 5 zones than there was in this original zone. So in other words, if you complete 6 formations out here, it's like having about 2.5 of the main pay zones completed in each well.
I gotcha.
Equivalent.
So it makes a lot of sense to me that you guys can complete 6 zones, because if you keep your costs down, because obviously if you drill a well for $1 million, it eats up all the profits. I mean, it doesn't matter if you produce oil or not, if it eats up, and that's the issue with shale oil. But I believe the biggest reason why you guys can is because Stephen Ford is the operator, and he has his own rigs, his own workover rigs, his own field equipment in trucks and so on and so forth. When most smaller operators, which is the only kind of deals you could get on the ground floor and get involved in to get those tax benefits, most of those operators, they don't have their own rigs. They're outsourcing most of their equipment. Okay. Yep. And so they're at the mercy of their cost, and they say, hey, oil's over $90 a barrel, pay up. And as where those other expenses that normally would be there are being passed on to the investors. And so we're able to drill 1 well out here and complete 6 zones for $180,000, as where another outfit, it might cost them $250,000 to $300,000 just to do the very same thing. So Kevin, I think we could wrap this thing up. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about the reason that a lot of people went for the bottom zone is they were drilling when oil was $30, $35 a barrel, and they had to go for the gusto, get down to that thickest zone and complete in the thickest zone and produce as economically as they could, because they were looking at $30, $35 oil. I know, because I was active out here in the late 80s and through the 90s, and we were drilling this type of well on $30 to $40 oil. And we had 2 main zones at 1,900 feet that we would go for. We didn't have 6 like these two. And we could not afford to frack everything that had oil and gas in it and hope for a great return, because at $35 oil, the operation cost would eat us alive. But that's
that
not
makes
the case
sense
now.
Yeah. So at $35 oil, it wouldn't make sense to complete most of these zones. Maybe 1 or 2 are economically feasible, as where the cost of completion to produce out of some of these zones is just not economically. But at 60, 70, 80, $90 oil, $100 oil, it's more than economically feasible to develop out here. In addition, you guys have the ability to develop for much less than most operators.
That's right. This is what we call an industry standard type of deal. In Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, 75% net revenue is generally where you start with the lease. And then if you take that lease as an operator and turn it to investors, the investor might get 60, 65%. That's not the case out here. We're assigning 75% of all the oil and gas production to the investors for a well that would cost more than this if you were a standard operator and subcontracting the drilling, completion, and frac work to other companies. You'd have to charge more, and you would have to give the investor less. But 75% net revenue assigned out is industry standard. Any oil company would be happy to do that sort of deal. And the wells are being drilled at cost, because Stephen Ford is making his money from lessee royalties within the field. It's in his best interest to make these the best wells that we can. Look at the books. It's very condensed. There's no excess wording in here. It's just making the point over and over that we're pretty confident what we're doing. The costs are being well controlled. Everything is quite transparent. All oil revenues will come directly from the oil refiner. They're not going to come through a filtration where extractions are made from the revenue. No, if we sell 50 barrels, then you get your proportion of that, and it'll be shown on every check stub that comes. But it's open and transparent. The book tells you as much as we know to tell you about this project, and I would encourage anybody to call me or email me at any time to discuss anything about the Wing Hollow project.
Yeah, I open up the door to all the partners if they want to talk directly with the operator, if they want to speak directly with Kevin Fowler, the project geologist, or if you want to go out to the field and actually see the well, see the oil coming out of the ground, we most definitely will allow you to do that. And so if you're interested in learning more about this program, it's a 40 well program. And in my description below, you could click the link and fill out the form, or just give me a call, and we'll teach you everything you need to know about this program. And if you have any other questions, feel free to comment on this video. Please subscribe to my channel. And thank you, Kevin, for taking the time today, and we'll talk soon.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, and get in touch with me if you have any questions.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye, Sean.